So a professor of mine who was a Filipino and who was a historian said that one thing that we need to consider was that the Japanese felt that surrendering to an enemy is the lowest act anybody can do, and it turns you into basically a low life. For them, you don't have any, um, there's no humanity left in you if you surrender to an enemy. And they were all encouraged to just kill themselves rather than allowing an enemy to kill them or surrendering. So they would rather die. Okay, he's on his bed. Hi. He decided to be clingy today. I had a friend from India asked me about the Bataan Death March, and we got into a very interesting discussion. She asked me some details, asked to clarify some stuff. Given that I learned about it back in school, you know, more than 20 pounds ago. It was very hard for me to recall all the details, but I tried my best. But we did get into some very interesting discussion, not necessarily historical. A lot of the details of that event is still being debated by historians, but it's a it's a very interesting discussion on how we apply certain dispositions and how our values and our belief and our culture actually affect history. So I want to share them with you. So for those of you who don't know, the Bataan Death March happened in the Philippines when the Japanese forced the prisoners of war of World War II, Filipinos and Americans, to endure a 66-mile walk and then an additional seven. I it happened. So the day after they bombed the Pearl Harbor, the Americans bombed the Pearl Harbor. Sorry, the Japanese bombed the Pearl Harbor. They started their assault in the Philippines, and um, and this was part of that entire thing. So those who surrendered were forced, as I've said, to endure that 66-mile walk, and then they were being transported from one place towards a and then to a camp where they were going to be held captive and they were going to be turned into slaves to serve the Japanese. So the apparently I think there were six I don't know, like 66,000 Filipinos, and then the rest were Americans, and they all surrendered to the Japanese. But during the entire walk, the Japanese showed no mercy. They were beating up Filipinos and Americans. So those who tried to escape, they were being shot or beaten to death. Those who couldn't continue anymore, they were beaten to death. Sometimes they were being shot or bayoneted. So the rifle that the Japanese were using had a knife towards the end, so they can shoot you or stab you with it. Some of them were being beheaded, and some of those the Japanese did out of fun. Some whatever they did it. That's the point. Uh, there were survivors. There were some who survived, and those who survived again they had to do an additional 7-mile walk towards the camp where they were going to be held captive and were going to be turned into prisoners. Sorry, slaves for the Japanese. The the that entire thing, the walk actually lasted 5 to 10 miles. I actually have an uncle who was part of the Japanese of that march. He was still a kid at that time. They were transported into this truck that actually was supposed to hold like 40 people, but 44 people, but they were 100 people in there, so there weren't enough ventilation. And then those who survived and went to the camp, they eventually died of starvation, or some of them were just tortured or shot to death. So a professor of mine who was a Filipino and who was a historian said that one thing that we need to consider is that the Japanese felt that surrendering to an enemy is the lowest act anybody can do, and it turns you into basically a low life. For them, you don't have any. Um, there's no humanity left in you if you surrender to an enemy, and they were all encouraged to just kill themselves rather than allowing an enemy to kill them or surrendering. So they would rather die than to surrender. Um, and so when those prisoners of war surrendered, for them it was a hideous act. It was unforgivable. They couldn't imagine why somebody would do that. For them, why you just it was better to kill themselves. Now, a huge part of that, it made me actually remember this quote from Games of Thrones. It was from, was it Tyrion Lannister, when he said that um, there was never a slave who did not choose to be a slave. It, it, the choice may be bondage or death, but the choice is always there. However, one thing to consider is that primarily the Philippines is a Catholic country, and we have been raised to believe that killing yourself is the worst thing you can ever do. It's the only unforgivable sin. So you can't do that. It would be, anything is better than killing yourself. So if you have to fight for your life in any way you can and allow, because killing yourself is unforgivable in the eyes of God. So that's one. Second is that, and so of course, faith, God goes above everything else, above everything else, and above anything else, anyone else, sorry. And then second is that we are very family oriented. We always put our family in, above ourselves, and so there's always the concern of what's gonna happen if I die, what's gonna happen with my family. If I'm alive, at the very least, I can, protect them or find them, and then we'll figure it out or whatever. But there's always, your family is always what you're thinking of, and I think that's a beautiful part of our culture. I don't want that to ever change. So a lot of those who were soldiers, who were put in the battle, you have to understand, aren't trained soldiers, and they were trying to survive. They were trying to protect their families. So for them, surviving for their family is way better than killing themselves. I understand the disposition of the Japanese of saying that it is better to kill yourself than to surrender. But it does, our faith and our own disposition, our own values don't allow that. It is not an option for us. So that aspect, that statement, that explanation from my professor, I understand. I understand where they are coming from, but it doesn't negate or it doesn't negate our own belief. There is a reason why many of those Filipinos and Americans surrendered, because based on our own belief and our own values and our own disposition, it is way better than killing yourself. Our relationship though with the Japanese now, there's no tension as far as I know. We're not at war with them, and if you talk to many Filipinos, not to those who were part of the death march or who has a direct family member who was in the death march, I'm sure maybe they have a different opinion. But my uncle who was in the death march, and my grandmother, I never remember, may they rest in peace, I never remember them talking bad about the Japanese or hating the Japanese, or when they see a Japanese they hate them. There was never any hatred. It was a part of a very, very painful history. Hopefully we've learned. I don't know if we have. Hopefully we have. And one of the cousin of a cousin actually ended up marrying a Japanese, and we all love that person. There was never any animosity. There was never any discrimination. And so I think also, again, a huge part of that is our own culture. Filipinos are very forgiving by nature. We have been, the Spaniards were actually, they colonized us for 300 years. We don't think badly of them. The we don't think badly of the Japanese. We don't think badly of the dictator that that actually dictator was actually a dictator of our country for 25 years. His name is Ferdinand Marcos, and his family, you know, they're back in office. So I think just by nature we're a very forgiving people. I don't know though if being under the being colonized by the Spaniards for 300 years, and basically for 300 years being treated as a second class, maybe third class, maybe fourth class citizens, made us feel inferior, that it made us feel like we don't have the right to demand for anything, an apology or whatever. I don't know if that has something to do with it, really. Um, but I don't have the expertise to determine that or say that for sure. But I just know that we're very resilient, we're very forgiving, and so that has sort of paved the way for us to have a very good relationship with the Japanese. And as far as I know, I mean, they don't do anything to us aside from discriminating us when it comes to visa. And I guess that falls on some statistical thing, because many Filipinos, well, that's another post, but anyway, I'm digressing. So, but that's an insight, I guess, on how the belief and the culture of the Japanese influenced how they treated the prisoners of war when they were in the Philippines. And then on the other hand, our disposition, our religion, faith, and belief influenced how we made decisions during that time. So I don't know, maybe a sociologist, historian, or psychologist can probably provide a better insight on, provide a better explanation on how the Japanese made decisions, how their culture influenced the decisions they made during the war. But from where I'm standing, it's just interesting to look and see and understand how different cultures, how our culture influenced the decisions that we make. I don't know if you came out of this video with more knowledge or more things to think about, but I just wanted to share that discussion that we had. And if you have comments, feedback, violent reactions, please put them in the description box, and just be respectful. Thank you.